We just heard from Tony Hsieh about cities should be stories that just keep on unfolding. And it's the case that cities are the longest lived human institutions by far, much longer than companies like Zappos, much longer than universities like Stanford. There's places like Jericho that people have been living in and prospering in for 10,000 years or so. But it's not guaranteed. So the topic is sort of sustainable cities, but none of us like that term much anymore. Resilient is another term that comes up in conservation instead of sustainable, but even that's a little defensive. Creative is more attractive. From the Long Now Foundation standpoint, we're interested in things that last 10,000 years. So in a way, we're going to be talking about how to keep these stories, these urban stories, unfolding decade after decade, century after century, millennium after millennium, at which point you're starting to intersect with large natural systems like climate change. And our speakers this morning have experience with that and other related natural things and long-term stuff like infrastructure. Eric Kleinenberg has written specifically about disasters in cities, some of them natural-based. And Marion Weiss is, like Tony Hsieh, a doer in the world, making amazing things in cities. And we figured out a logical sequence, and Eric starts.
Deal. All right, thank you very much. Let me get this going. Oops, great, very fast. So my premise today is going to be that climate change is one of the most serious threats that we face as a species, maybe the most serious and formidable challenge for us. And another premise today is that now that we know so much in the science of climate change, many of the toughest questions for us to tackle are social or behavioral, sociological, and have to do with the way we build our cities and communities, and I want to focus on that today. And the way that I want to do that is by taking you back to the city I grew up in, where I did my first research on this topic, Chicago. And specifically, I want to take you back to a week in the summer of 1995, where the temperature hit 106 degrees, and the heat index, which is the felt weather, was 126 for about 2.5 days. What happened is everybody in Chicago turned on their air conditioning, which is what we all do in cities when it gets hot. In fact, every time it gets hot in a city these days, we set a record for energy consumption, and our power grids aren't really up to the challenge of delivering the resources we need, and so inevitably, we strain them or they collapse. That happened in Chicago. This is an image of workers spraying down the substation, trying to keep it cool. Guess what didn't work? That technique. About 250,000 homes and far more people lost power, some for a couple days. Also, we now know when there are power outages, you can't get water above the 6th floor of a high-rise building. And when lots of people open up fire hydrants, you lose water pressure, so we're talking about no energy, no water for a long period of time. The health infrastructure also gets crippled during extreme events, and we can expect more extreme events as the climate changes. In Chicago, about half the hospitals that week went on bypass, which means that they couldn't take any more patients into the emergency rooms. They didn't have places for them, and they had no system for monitoring which hospitals were full and which were not. So people were driving around for up to 10 miles without being able to find a bed. The result of this, as seen dramatically in this image, is more than 700 people died from a heat wave that lasted a very short time. I know that you know this story because we all talk about the Great Chicago Heat Wave all the time. It was a real touchstone experience in American history, really a game changer, right? I know that's not true in any way whatsoever. We never talk about it. It was a non-event, which is why I wrote a book about it. And one of the really dramatic and powerful things that emerged from that story is people did not just die. Hundreds died alone. And were not discovered for quite some time after they died, which forces us to really ask questions, not just about why the infrastructure breaks down, but also how and why our social infrastructure breaks down. And I've spent a lot of my work as a sociologist thinking about the relationship between social infrastructure and cities and climate. Now, you all know recently a number of people got Nobel Prizes for their contributions to science. I did not get a Nobel Prize for this map, which shows the distribution of deaths in Chicago during the heat wave and also the distribution of poverty. I didn't get the Nobel Prize not only because they don't award one for sociology, but also because we know this. it's totally predictable which people and which places will be most affected by different kinds of disasters, which means we can really target resources in advance of a disaster, but we routinely fail to do this, to protect lives in obvious ways. That's not scientifically interesting. I was really interested in understanding much more about why certain kinds of vulnerable places wound up doing very badly during this heat wave, while other very vulnerable places, seemingly vulnerable places, wound up doing incredibly well. Studying the cases of positive deviance was fascinating for me. It turns out that the neighborhoods in Chicago that were most vulnerable, that really placed residents at risk of dying alone, were places that had a social infrastructure that looked a lot like this. It wasn't simply that they were poor, it wasn't simply that they were segregated, it's that they didn't have streets and sidewalks and commercial life, a lot of the amenities that draw us together, as we heard in the last presentation, and into social life. This turns out to be crucial not just every day, but also during crises. This neighborhood had a death rate that was 10 times higher than the one across the street, which was comparably poor, comparably vulnerable during the heat wave. But also, if you live in this neighborhood, you have a 5-year lower life expectancy than if you live across the street. The everyday matters as well. One reason you don't know about what happened during the heat wave in Chicago is because we did everything possible to not learn the lessons about this touchstone event. The city refused to hold public hearings, literally refused to hold them, and this is the one major report that Chicago released. It is in my book among the most cynical political documents you could ever find, not only because the concept heat wave does not appear, but also, as you'll see, because there is a snowflake on the cover. The year after my book came out in 2003, there was a heat wave in Europe. It lasted 3 weeks. The estimates of the deaths are between 35,000 and 70,000, and every political official said, how could we have known that this kind of thing would happen? Very humiliating moment for a sociologist who'd just written a book about this very issue, but it tells us we really have to learn when things go wrong. I took this lesson to heart when Sandy hit the city where I have lived for the last dozen years, Manhattan. This is an image that remains very powerful, not least because those of us who live in downtown Manhattan think that we are the center of power in the world, and that it's literally impossible that the forces that be out there would let downtown Manhattan go without power for as long as we did, but this was a striking image of infrastructure failure. One of the reasons that infrastructure fails in cities when there's extreme storms these days is because the technology we use to sustain the power grid in most parts of the country is the pole. We put poles with lines up. We put them right under trees that we don't trim, and predictably the trees fall down, the power goes out, we suffer economic losses and put them back up on the poles again. We need to be much smarter about this. Some of the infrastructure repairs seem relatively easy conceptually, some are hard. What's amazing about this image of the subway system is it's 86th Street, which was not flooded in any way whatsoever. But our subways were built to flood like bathtubs, and that's what they do when the water comes. The communications infrastructure is by no means capable of withstanding the kinds of extreme storms that we're going to see as the climate changes. So routinely, not only do streets and transit fail, but also we find ourselves isolated at the very moment when we most need information to find out what to do, who's safe, who isn't safe, and where we should go. We don't regulate the cell phone industry today as anything other than an entertainment industry, and there's a major role for governments to play in thinking about how we set up infrastructure so that they work when we need them most. This is an image from the NYU hospital where it took heroic work to keep the babies in the NICU alive as the power went out. It turns out that the hospital corridor for New York City is right in the floodplain along the East River, and we were really poorly prepared for dealing with the kind of water that came in. What can we do to do climate security better? It's my view that in coming years, we will have no choice but to have projects and investments in climate security analogous to the kinds of investments we made in homeland security after September 11th. And much of my work is dedicated to the project of making sure that we don't screw things up as badly with the climate as we did with homeland security. One thing we could do to try to protect cities is build giant walls around them. For those of you who haven't been to New York City recently, that wall next to the Verrazano Bridge does not exist, but many people thought that would be the best way to keep the water out. You can try very hard to keep the water out these days, but you're going to fail. So another set of ideas that I've been working on as part of the research team for the Rebuild by Design competition, which is a White House and HUD project to rebuild the region after Sandy, involves trying to build protective systems that will work for the city in the event of an extreme event, but will also improve the quality of everyday life for people. They involve natural infrastructure and other systems that can do things like store water in the event of a storm surge. This is a design for a park where the walls come up and it becomes a water basin that can funnel water to other parts of the region, but that can also be skate parks and playgrounds and places for people to congregate all the time. This is another example of a place in New York City. It's a community organization called the Red Hook Initiative, which helps young people and their families on most days, but during the crisis wound up being a place that could be flexibly adapted into a recovery space, serving tens of thousands of people when the power went out. I moved to New York City a dozen years ago because of the sparkling lights and the big towers. I had a dream about what life would be like. After Sandy, when I close my eyes and think of New York City, I can't help but see that also, and I think a growing number of people are changing the ways they see cities as the climate changes. It's my hope, but also my belief based on a lot of the most exciting social science we have, that if we design cities to promote social interaction, if we design cities with the social infrastructure in mind, we can not only protect them better from the ravages of climate change, but also make life better all the time. Thank you.
All right. Marion, you're on. Go for it.
Didn't get to this.
Well, Eric, you and I share a couple of the same slides, which I find pretty remarkable. I think that we share the preoccupation with the idea that infrastructure needs to do more work, and that somehow the systems of the city, whether they're social, cultural, infrastructural, or architectural, that if they are conceived together rather than apart, that the capacity of actually allowing these things to do more work simultaneously is what we need to think about as designers. I'm an architect, Marion Weisman-Freddy. Architecture, Landscape, Urbanism is the name of our firm, and I'm a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, where the kind of research lens of the simultaneous look at planning, architecture, and landscape together is a preoccupation. One of the things that intrigued us as architects, Michael Manfredi and I entered competitions where the questions were not just the perfect object of architecture, but somehow raising questions about belonging to something far larger. And while the work of architecture is often getting down to the detail, it seems that the creative obligation to think in section and not just in plan is where there is an opportunity for a kind of invention to occur. So if we start to think about systemic things, we can say that the unnatural and natural systems, which often seem apart, and this is Roe Etheridge's Junction Atlanta photograph over there on the right, and on the left, your typical kind of waterway flooding. That if we can start to think of these things not as apart from each other, but somehow as synthetically linked, that we could say that maybe we could find that the idea of public nature inhabited within infrastructures that have traditionally been monofunctional could be an inspiration to build. Not unlike the slides that Eric was showing, this is Hurricane Sandy in New York. And one of those things that was interesting is that this is a case where the flows of water and the presence of infrastructure co-located clearly didn't work. But if we think about section, which by that I mean from here to here as opposed to plan, which maps and plans suggest this direction, that the section can do more work. And on this side here, you can see the terraces in Yunnan province actually cultivate section and water together to create a productive idea of growth. On the right, if you look at Specchi's, the Spanish Steps in Rome, there was a case of a sectional grade change in the city that had a big disconnect and a cart for horses route that would be about 1.5 miles, but a shortcut that could have been so beautifully inhabited that in fact, I'd love to take credit for this project, but I can't. It really creates the most wonderful social artifact and cultural obligation now as a destination and connector in that city. Now, there's the problem that happens when infrastructure invades a city or community by the nature of the necessity of speed and connection. And in the early 50s, Robert Moses said, we're going to send the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway through the middle of Brooklyn Heights. If you know Brooklyn Heights, it's more talkative than any academic community you can imagine with more authors. They had a different response. And they hired on their own as a community, Clark and Rapwana in 1952, to actually question the section of Brooklyn Heights to say perhaps we can actually have northbound, southbound, local road, and a pedestrian walkway simultaneously co-located and not ruin our community. That's been an inspiration for us in many ways. And I think, Eric, this is our first slide duplicate here. This is Ewan Bond's photograph of Manhattan unraveling during Hurricane Sandy. The whole burden on the infrastructure was so great that it was the first time that the City of Lights lost their lights. We were working at exactly the same time at Hunters Point South in the Waterfront Park. And in advance of that, this is a waterfront park, a vision of Mayor Bloomberg, where the question was to take a community across the river from the UN, not the most vibrant one, and bring the first large-scale affordable housing initiative to the city with 5,000 units of housing. This piece of land, though, used to be a wetland. Then it was an urban environment that was transformed into an active port in the 1900s, and then this is it as we discovered it for our project. Now, we were preoccupied with flooding long before Hurricane Sandy, in part because we had brought our studios to New Orleans and actually been researching both the Delta Works and all the other innovative infrastructures that could deal with water. And so as we looked at our idea for what it might mean to transform this waterfront edge into something that was not just a park in advance of this community, but maybe in advance of flooding, we didn't get the best response from our client, the city. And yet these were drawings that we shared internally because we said this new waterfront park needed to do more work. We needed to host water, resist it, submit to it, and leverage it. And this was our diagram that would show a before and after, if you can follow the water, that this needed to be able to thrive and embrace those moments of storm surge. And so you could see this is a high point of it, high and low, and rather than a deteriorating edge, we're having simultaneously creating wetlands and also a high point, and a playing field that also is a water container basin. And a large territory, which is high density use. This is first phase. We're designing the second phase, which will start construction in 8 months. But the idea that the recollection of those industrial rails could be part of it, that a beach could be created, that the lens to the city could be enhanced, that the identity of playing and play in a community could actually do work so that the pavilion itself is a solar collector which generates all the power in the park and a water collector which then irrigates the park. So this hard-working infrastructure of what looks to be a shade pavilion is actually a ferry terminal so that when all the roads are disabled, the access by boat to the community is enhanced, and that even at sunset, this place of connection is also a place of romance. So we start to think about what does it mean to make legible these green systems. And at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, the idea of the city and the garden have been either or for too long. And as you could see, the garden is extraordinary, the city is less than compelling. That's the visitor center as it stood when we found it. We were told to actually do something in the middle of the parking lot, way away, and then cut through a berm. We said that was the wrong answer. Let's pull people from that city edge, but mix urban life and nature together, and actually create a portal that now on Mother's Day welcomes 44,000 visitors in one day, comes to the edge of the city, pulls through, brings you to a place of a set of pathways into an exhibition system or out into the garden. But ultimately, it really is, again, this operation and section where 44,000 plants are a curated green roof, where it's actually a lens to engage and learn about this kind of new urban nature. Urban nature has succeeded. That green roof has hosted all kinds of things, but the whole idea is how can we be 100% artificial and 100% natural at the same time? Because these things are, in fact, what we're doing. Urban life is, in fact, natural and artificial. Penn Singh Technology Center, taking research of an academy and an urban setting, tying them together, creating a green, forcing the scientists to interact with each other, come out of their shell into this ascending spiral of green, nature, and urban identity. And that sort of transformation then leads to a seminal project for us at the Olympic Sculpture Park, where the Seattle Art Museum and the city of Seattle together said, let's let art come to the public and the public to the park. The piece of land contaminated, 40-foot grade change, failing seawall, highway, train tracks, everything you'd dream of. And so our thing was to actually say, don't cover it up, which would they said full funding like Millennium Park would do, but maybe allow the infrastructure of that setting to inspire something new, where we could co-locate pedestrian life and art with 365,000 cubic yards of earth to encapsulate the contaminated soil, cross over this setting with this new landscape that would bring urban life and art together. So this is the image of our park, but really what interested us was this ability to how infrastructure do more work, allow a highway to be part of the park, to allow the building with its layered walls to actually be seismically flexible so that the walls wouldn't crack, so that the art like Richard Serra could also be co-located with yoga, so that Calder's Eagle could finally be seen against the Olympic Mountains, so that the train tracks with the obligatory 23-foot-6 clearance could be coincident with art, so that that water's edge could be brought into focus, and that failing seawall could be turned into a new beach, and with federal funding, we could actually stabilize what they said would be a $60 million job, Army Corps of Engineer, our job $3.5 million, and that job actually created new restored water habitat and salmon habitat, so that the idea of a thriving community subsurface in the water could be co-located with the idea of new urban life, and that new urban life could actually be associated with bringing people to the city, and the city to the park, and the park to the art. So thank you.
All right.